Hi everyone, happy Sunday. I miss you all so much and I wish we could be together, but I know we're all doing our part to stay inside and stay safe, and so that's the best that we can do in a situation like this. I'm actually at my parents' house, so in the house that I grew up in. I'm so about 200 miles away, or like 3 hours from San Diego. I was in San Diego for a while, probably like a week or so into the quarantine, maybe 2 weeks for some of you. I don't remember when it started, honestly. I don't even know what day it is. But yeah, I just got to a point where I was basically there by myself all day long. Two of my roommates had moved out. I mean, all of our stuff is still in the house, but they were with their parents, and I just wanted to be with my parents, and I wanted to be with my sister. And I'm sure some of you can't relate to that right now. I'm sure some of you are at the end of your ropes with your families, but I'm telling you, it is so nice to be around people instead of being alone. Being alone was really hard, especially when there's a lot of scary things going on and just getting really nervous about everyone. It's really nice to be around family and to be at home. All right, so let's just jump right in. Today is the Sunday before Easter, which is also known as Palm Sunday. This is the day that in the Gospels Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and he was greeted with a large crowd that they all laid down palm branches and tree branches, and they laid their coats down on the ground so he didn't have to walk on the ground, and they shouted Hosanna, and they were basically just super excited that he was coming into the city of Jerusalem. This was like the height of his ministry, the height of his popularity, but unfortunately this is also the high moment before it really all starts to go downhill. So a lot of churches also include a little bit of that downhill, a little bit of that sadness into Palm Sunday, because if you only come Sunday to Sunday, there's a lot of stuff that happens in between Palm Sunday and Easter, and they want to include that so you kind of get the story, even if you can't make it midweek to some services. So I know here at our church we do midweek services, Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday, to honor those days in between. But, you know, if you're only able to come on Sundays, you would miss parts of the story. And so I want to talk about some of those somber parts tonight, because I'm sure you've already heard the story of Palm Sunday probably 100 times. I mean, maybe not that many, but you know the story, and we've already talked about it this morning if you watched service. So I want to talk about some of the somber parts that come after. So the scripture that I want to look at for this lesson is the same one that we talked about this morning. There were two gospel passages from this morning's service, but I want to look at the second one, which is Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 to 46. So this is the part of the story where Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and he brings along a couple of the disciples, and basically just what happens in the garden. So I'm going to be reading Matthew 26, 36 to 46 from the NRSV version, because that's what I have on my computer. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself onto the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for the second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So if you know the story of Holy Week and you know the story of the Gospels, you probably know what's come right before this part of the story, and you probably know what will come next after this part. So before this, Jesus celebrated the Passover dinner with all of his disciples, which is what we now call the Last Supper, and it's the event that we think of every time we have communion. At that dinner, he announced to his disciples that his time was coming to a close, but they didn't really get it. And then he also announced that one of the disciples in the room would betray him. And then they go to the garden, which is the part we just read, and the disciples disappoint Jesus because they just keep falling asleep, even though he specifically asks them to stay awake with him. Then, after this part, Judas brings the Roman guards into the garden and betrays Jesus there in front of the other disciples. There's a whole thing. That part of the story I think is super interesting. I think this whole story is really interesting. I love this time of the Christian year, Holy Week. It's just very fascinating, and I love these scriptures. There's so much to them. So I would recommend reading them. You have time this week to read it. I think it's a great time to do that. We're looking a lot at the Gospel of Matthew, I think, just as a church right now. That's kind of where our lectionary is taking us for the year. So I would recommend reading the Gospel of Matthew, but if you have time to read all 4 versions, go ahead and read them. They're all very interesting. There's a lot of things that are very similar, and then there are definitely some differences. So if you have time, I would definitely recommend checking it out. So what I specifically want to talk about in this lesson today is grief and disappointment, which I know is a super cheery topic for a super cheery time, but grief and disappointment is something that I think we're all dealing with right now, and for some of us, we've been dealing with it for a while. And I don't know about you, but reading this part of the gospel and seeing that Jesus experienced grief and anger and deep sadness because of his relationships with his friends and to other humans, it just reminds me that while Jesus was fully God, he was also fully human. He lived on the same earth that we live on and experienced a lot of the same things that we do. And it brings me some comfort and reminds me that I'm not alone in my feelings. Everyone feels a lot of these things at some point in their lives, even Jesus. God sent Jesus to earth to experience the fullness of humanity, which means the good, the bad, and the ugly. He didn't just get to experience all the fun stuff. He also got to experience some of these really hard things, and he had to suffer, and it's just, it's crazy. So let's dig into this passage a little bit. So Jesus brings 3 of his closest friends to the garden with him. So these are Peter, James, and John. These disciples have been with him from the beginning. They've been journeying together probably 3 years at this point. These are the guys that when Jesus told them they're no longer going to be fishermen, but they're going to be fishers of men, that's these guys. They've been with him since the beginning. They were probably the first people to sign up for this movement. And he tells them, these is his 3 best friends, basically. And he tells them that he's feeling deeply grieved, just very, very sad. And he asks them to stay awake with him, which should be simple enough, right? Then he goes off to pray, and he's trying to plead his case to God and to try to get out of the one thing that he knows he still has to do. He comes back to his friends, and he just finds them knocked out, asleep. The one thing that he asked them specifically not to do. And couldn't they just sacrifice a little bit for him? He's been with them for 3 years. They've probably spent every single day together. They just know each other intimately. They've been in it for 3 years, and they couldn't stay awake for, 30 minutes. How long was he gone? There's no way they couldn't just keep their eyes open, right? So he gives them another chance, goes off to pray again. And in this second prayer, he accepts his fate, basically. If you look at the words, it says, "My Father, if this cup cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." So, that's a really heavy thing that he just accepted. He just accepted his own death was imminent, which is really crazy to stomach. I don't think any of us can really stomach that right now in our lives. But he goes back to see his friends after accepting his fate, really. And he's disappointed by them again for the exact same thing. They made the exact same mistake twice, back-to-back, same evening. He gives them one last chance. He prays again, just kind of to get some closure, I think. And again, they fall asleep. He tells them the consequences of their actions by falling asleep. They've officially run out of their time with him. Like, Jesus was disappointed by their actions and disappointed that the three of his closest friends could not sacrifice just a little bit of sleep to be with him in his time of need. And I'm sure that some of us have been disappointed by the actions of some of our friends. Maybe not in this extreme of a situation, but it still hurts, doesn't it? All right, so let's look at the other people in the story, the disciples. So Peter, James, and John. They gave up everything to follow Jesus. Like, they gave away all their possessions, and they left their jobs, and they left their families. And yet they couldn't give up just a little bit of time to spend with him in this, like, one of his darkest hours. Honestly, the disciples probably didn't even realize what they were going to be losing when they fell asleep. They probably just thought, this is a normal day, hanging with our friend Jesus, hanging with our buddy, and we're kind of tired, and he's going to go off and do his thing, so we're just going to let our eyes close, and then boom, they're asleep. They probably tried to stay awake, but it doesn't seem like they tried super hard. You know, we don't really know, but it doesn't seem like they tried super hard. But, you know, they didn't think Jesus was going to be gone. They were at the height of their ministry. They just got welcomed into Jerusalem by like a huge parade of people. They were doing so well. They were doing so much. There's no way he was just going to be gone. Like, they wouldn't have understood that even if they kind of knew that it was coming. So they were really just taking his presence for granted. And in a short time, they would be grieving his loss, grieving their loss of his life at the foot of the cross. So right now, we're all grieving a lot of different things. I think we're all grieving the loss of our normal way of life, probably one of the biggest things. Things that we took for granted and loved are now gone. Like for me, I'm grieving the loss of being able to go to church, being able to go to work and see my coworkers, getting to have life group and see you guys all on Sundays and Wednesdays. And also, like, on a much more trivial level, I'm also really missing going to coffee shops. I just really miss it, you know. I love seeing the hustle and bustle of life, and I love drinking coffee that someone else made for me. It's obviously so much better than when I make it for myself. You know, it's just, these are all things that I just kind of took for granted, and I wish that I could have those things right now, but, you know, that's just not the way that the world is right now. Some of us might be grieving the loss of life. I feel really, really fortunate that no one I know, directly at least, has died from coronavirus or complications related to coronavirus, and at least not yet. And I'm really hoping that I don't know anyone that dies from this. But there have been some significant deaths that are either like celebrities or other like famous creatives or even like doctors and nurses who have been on the front lines who contracted it and then they died from it. And we are grieving a lot of those losses in different ways, you know. We are saddened to hear this sad news, and it's harsh and it's scary to think about how that might affect us in our lives. But also I know that some of us have been grieving deaths that, you know, they might not be super recent, but even if they're semi-recent, it still hurts. Grief takes a long time to process. So I'm going to open up a little bit here. I don't know how many of you know this, but I am still grieving a death that happened earlier this year. In late August 2019, one of my really, really good childhood friends passed away very suddenly from a pulmonary embolism, which is basically like a heart attack for your lungs, I think. Marlene can probably explain this better than I can because I just tried to read up on it really quick, but it was so hard to even process it in the wake of my friend's death that I barely just understood it. But it was really so sudden. She just had the flu, and then all of a sudden my mom calls and says that she died and she was alone in her house. She was only 23. She was 10 months older than me. And I've been friends with her for like 12, 15 years. We grew up going to the same church together. We played in the bell choir. We sang the choir. We acolyted. We did confirmation together. We were like VBS helpers. We went to camp together. All the things you guys do, all the things that you guys get to do with your friends from youth group, we were there. We were inseparable. We were there every single week, every single meeting. We didn't miss one. So just to have someone who'd been so present in your life gone just like that it takes a while to understand. And even though I hadn't seen her in a while because she went to a different college in a complete opposite end of the state from San Diego, she went to Humboldt, and so we weren't exactly close, like physically close, I still deeply cherish her friendship and all of the memories and time that we had together. And so a lot of these fears from this grief that I've had are very, very prevalent right now. A lot of people are experiencing these things that I'm afraid of with loved ones who have COVID. So it's very realistic and very present in my life. And I'm sure that some of you are living with your fears right now too, and thinking about loved ones that you or your family may have lost this year and how scary it is. And you can really put yourself in the shoes of these other people who are losing loved ones to COVID and coronavirus right now. It's very scary. But the thing about Holy Week and Lent in general, just as a whole, is that we have to face some really dark truths about humanity. You know, we start Lent off with Ash Wednesday. So I know that we talked about this if you come to Life Group. Ash Wednesday is when we're reminded that human life has to end. It must end. Our time on earth ends, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And then for the next 6 weeks, we sacrifice things that we depend on or that we have put a dependency on. And this year, we sacrificed a lot. We didn't necessarily go into this season of Lent planning to sacrifice things. The thing I meant to give up, I couldn't because of coronavirus. I planned to give up single-use plastics, and everything has to be in plastic now because we can't use reusable containers because we're so afraid of spreading this virus, which is a valid fear. But man, it was disappointing at first to think I was doing so well, and then this happened, and then we sacrificed anyway. We all sacrificed getting to be around other people. We sacrificed our normal way of life. We sacrificed our toilet paper. There's not a lot of toilet paper at the stores, or we sacrificed this or that or whatever. And in the last week of Lent, getting back on topic, in the last week of Lent, we talk about the last week of life for the Son of God, who was sent to earth to save humanity, and humanity killed him for it. This time is really harsh and it's really dark. But if we don't acknowledge these lowest of lows and the miracle, then the miracle of Easter just doesn't feel as powerful. Without acknowledging the darkness of life, injustice and backstabbing and murder and, a whole slew of other things, right? The new life that Jesus brings on Easter just doesn't seem that big. It's like, yeah, whatever. We kind of take it for granted. He's alive, yeah, whatever. And then we know we have salvation through a sacrifice. Haha, yeah, all right. You just kind of accept it, especially if you've been in the church for a long time. If you grew up in it like I have and like a lot of us have, you just kind of are like, Easter is that time of year where I dress up and we find eggs and we talk about Jesus being alive. And it's always a big deal. But what does it really mean? What is Easter as a day and as a event in world history and in the Christian life? What does that mean to us? So this week, I want to challenge you all to think about the miracle of Easter and what it really means to you and to your life. So I want you to think about it as we talk through all these dark services and all these dark scriptures and times together. And I want you to think about it next week when we celebrate our new life together. So I am going to put some discussion questions in the thing below, and we're going to talk about it in a Zoom call. If you're watching this at the premiere time, we're going to be having our Zoom call at 6:30, but if you're watching it back later, you can still read the discussion questions in the prayer below and have a time of reflection. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that this was a good time, and I hope that you learned something, or at least that it brought you to reflect on some of these big questions. Thanks.